Welcome, everybody. My name is Jeff Pospisil, and I'm the treasurer for the Dakotas Minnesota United Methodist Foundations, as well as the Dakotas Conference. And I'm here with Sherry.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Sherry Meister. I am the director of the Dakotas and Minnesota Methodist Foundations. And so it's great to be here tonight, and we're certainly appreciate all of you who are joining us.
It's a beautiful day to be inside watching a webinar.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't think we would have got as big of attendance yesterday, Jeff.
No, I don't think so either. 50 degrees. Anyway, so this quarter's webinar is on investigating your balance sheet. And I do have the invest there in red because one of the things I feel like, as I've seen so many different balance sheets from churches, is that a lot of times it's a very neglected financial statement. A lot of times it's also not really used that much to make decisions. I think we normally flip past it and go right to our budget report or whatever, our profit and loss or whatever. So, but I think it's one of those things where it is a very useful tool. And this time of year, when a number of churches are doing their audits, this might be one of your focuses too, is to let's go ahead and dig into our balance sheet, make sure we understand it. Are there any decisions to be made based on that? So why don't we go ahead and that is really part of the reason why we see this. As I said, we deal with a number of churches. I was with one church just Saturday. Their balance sheet, all they had was the checking account on there and their payroll liability. They didn't have their savings on there, which was $17,000. It wasn't significant. They also didn't have their debt on there, which was $89,000, kind of significant. So Sherry, I'm sure you've seen a bunch of different issues as well.
Yeah, Jeff, we were talking earlier about a church that finally got their balance sheet and everything in line and realized that they have $100,000 in reserves that not everybody was aware of and what to do with. So we were able to talk through that, and we'll see some more of that tonight, but talk through it on how those dollars that are sitting there can be turned into money, into ministry. That those can be turned into ministry, and gives them a great opportunity to sort of look at their balance sheet with a different perspective.
Because you see it a lot where a church might feel poor, but they might have whatever it is, 200, 300,000, $1 million in the bank somewhere. I mean, you've actually seen $1 million in a church that feels like they're poor, right?
Right. Yeah. And we can't touch that. And that's what I hear people say. We can't touch that. That was given to the church for a rainy day, for emergency. We can't touch it. And so we start to work with them on how it's possible to touch the earnings of that and still leave the principal if that's the biggest concern that they have.
Yeah.
The main concern.
And I do think that's one of the things that you drive. I mean, your whole part of your mission is connecting donors and their resources with ministry. And really, why did somebody give there? They didn't give it to you so you could earn a 0.1% in a savings account necessarily. So, so we do have a question. So thinking about your church's balance sheet or whatever you might call it, by the way, the statement of financial position or whatever it has your assets and your liabilities on there. How would you what show best represents your state of your balance sheet? Hoarders, in other words, you've just accumulated a bunch of junk on there and you really don't know what it all is. Unsolved mysteries, and that it's just confusing. You don't know what it means. Dirty jobs. It works. It ain't pretty, but it works. Martha Stewart show. Everything's neat, tidy, put together. Yeah, I should make some kind of a in jail kind of comment, but I won't.
Not anymore, Jeff. She's
not anymore.
No longer there.
Dateline, missing in America. So you never even seen your church's balance sheet. So go ahead and vote, and we'll see what we have.
I'd say as everyone's voting too, when you say what's missing on the balance, or hey, you've never seen the balance sheet, also what's missing on the balance sheet? Yeah. What is, and is it a completely different account where they're keeping that investment account or those reserves account in another place, and it doesn't show up on the church's full picture with their balance sheet.
Do we have some results here? Let's see, Martha, hey, good job, people.
Right.
So that makes it a lot easier, because when there's cleanup, that ends up complicating your mess. So you get excellent churches this time. So a couple of them with missing ones, a couple of them it's kind of a mystery, and a couple dirty jobs, but half of them it's nice and tidy, Martha Stewart. So good job. All right, so just a quick basics. This is accounting 101. So on your balance sheet, it's assets equals liabilities plus equity. Nobody really understands equity. Very few people understand equity. So what I normally do is, it's easy to know how much assets you have. That's how much you have in your bank accounts, in your investment accounts. Also, some churches will put their property on there. It's also easy to know how much you owe. So that's usually a mortgage or something like that. Maybe it's your payroll liabilities. So I normally switch it around and do assets minus liability equals equity. There's your little algebra too in there. So what does this mean? Here's just a really quick example. If we had a really simple balance sheet where we had 10,000 in checking, 25,000 in investments, and then property that cost 500,000, accounts payable. So that's just the bills that are due for 1,000. And a mortgage of 300,000. What would our equity look like? The equity section is a lot of times what I see is the most messed up. So we might have an equity account called investment in fixed assets. That's one I recommend. And that's just purely the amount of your property minus your mortgage equals that equity balance. So you could post the equity balance for investment in fixed assets of 200,000. Let's say that $25,000 investment is a scholarship fund. So then you would have another account in your equity side of 25,000 for your scholarship fund. And that means whatever's left over is unrestricted. So that's 10,000 in checking minus your bills that are due, accounts payable equals 9,000 in unrestricted. So it might have looked like you had $535,000 in assets, but you really only had $9,000 that's unrestricted. So that's kind of the power of the accounting equation, I guess. So, all right. So now the first step, I want to say, for most of us, it is good to go looking at your balance sheet with brand new eyes as much as you can. Not be afraid of asking dumb questions, not be afraid of doing anything else, and a lot of good questions to start you off on. So the first one, is anything missing? So I was working with the church several years ago, and I looked at it. They had various investments and everything else. And then it came about that they also had an endowment committee. And the interesting thing is the endowment committee wouldn't let you know how much money they had. But it was missing. So they had an asset there that wasn't on the books because people wanted to keep it secret. So, which is not helpful to church leaders, by the way. Anyway.
And that's not the only church we've seen that in, Jeff. This is more common than we would like to admit.
All the time. There's by the way, we also get money from our land that we own, or we get money from whatever. It's just interesting that there's a number of these things that are just don't make the books because it might complicate things, and then I'd have to release my hoard. So Sherry, this is one of your favorites. So
we see balance sheets and budgets when they come into us if they want that fresh set of eyes. And many times they are funding something that happened in their church years ago, and they hope that ministry will come back. And not to over exaggerate it, but everybody would like to have 50 to 90 kids in their Sunday school programs from K-12, and those have changed, and how Sunday school is available has changed, and all of those things. But that's one line item that doesn't necessarily change. And then you're not being able to use those monies for ministries in another area, even knowing Sunday school isn't going to look the same as it did when this line item was built. And yeah.
And I see a lot of it too, where you'd have a bunch of these little memorial accounts or different ones that are just maybe they're old project accounts, like the United Methodist Men. Maybe they went on a van trip 5 years ago and they had $17 left over, so we're going to hold a place for that. You know, you always have a bunch of those little ones, and as an accountant it kind of drives you nuts. So the idea of actually taking that on to clean it up. So another one is, what assets are restricted? And really, once you start asking that, because that's what a lot of people say, that it's locked up. You know, this is for missions, this is for the scholarship, this is for youth. But that's when you start really digging in. So how is it restricted? You know, how much can be spent? What can it be spent on? Who can spend it? You know, who has authority? And a lot of that stuff, there should be some answers to that when you're asking those questions. So.
Yeah, Jeff, in that, I mean, if you go back to that just a second, in those restrictions, that's one of the things that our office will do and help people work through that with your church or your committees to help them understand. You know, Jeff and I are always telling church stories, but we had one a number of years ago that we both went out to see if they would be wanting to invest with us. And one of the members of the finance committee said, the donor wanted that to always stay local, those dollars, instead of bringing them with us. And so we asked what the documentation was. Was that a fact, or was that him wishing that that's what the donor had done? Because the donor was no longer living, we couldn't go back and ask. But since then, they have found out that they didn't necessarily have to have it locally invested, and they are now part of our accounts. But it's not uncommon for somebody at the table to project what they're hoping those dollars are for. And if you have the documentation, that's a really good opportunity to set some of those restrictions straight so that the dollars are spent to the intent of the donor.
Yeah, I mean, and that's an excellent, the foundation does this really well. That's just kind of, and we'll be coming back to this actually later on as we talk about some other things. But I mean, even this week, you're going to meet with the donor. And the key thing you're going to do is talk about this type of thing. I mean, because even helping your donors understand and set a restriction that's also forward looking. So you might say, this is for, I did a video last week about somebody giving to the organ fund. Well, what happens if one day the organ goes away? You know, what should this go for? Well, then it could go for the music ministry or whatever it is. There'll always be music, but it may not always be the organ. So, but even just having those kind of conversations, you know, maybe they would say no, and say, if the organ's not around, put it towards kids ministry, put it towards whatever, the building, but at least let them think through that. So, all right. This is not, I don't know, this is not pure accounting or anything like that, but I basically thought through the different funds that I've seen churches have. I'm going to check the chat real quick. Hey, it's Marge. So anyway, these are the ones that I see most often, is that a lot of funds, and we're going to define these a little bit more. A lot of churches, they might have a permanent type of fund. So funds that are sticking around forever. In the accounting world, we would call these permanently restricted funds, where you can't touch the principal. The next two would be temporarily restricted, is what we would call them, but they're money given for a project by a donor, or they're money given towards a program. So both of these all these top rows are really, the restrictions are set by the donors. And then the next one we have is reserves, and that's more of what your church board would designate, or maybe the charge conference would designate. So what do you need for reserves? So like a rainy day fund, or maybe it's a roof fund, or whatever it happens to be. And then the last one, whatever's left over is unrestricted, and hopefully it's more than what's in that offering plate. So I didn't realize I put a very poor
Should be
offering plate in there.
overflowing,
I
Jeff.
know, I should have put, but that's actually a lot of times. So I don't know how many of you guys have seen this in your churches, but I'll see churches that have not done that equity fix, to look at their equity, and they'll find out that they are actually underwater and they're unrestricted. So they have a negative unrestricted balance because they only have, let's just say they have $50,000 in the bank, but they show that whatever it is, 60,000 is for various designated programs or donor restricted things. And so that leaves you a negative 10,000 in your unrestricted. And that sadly is kind of common, where people will overspend and unintentionally borrow from their restricted gifts. So
Jeff, let's say that this offering plate is more to the fact, it's probably circled around again. It's more to the fact that there's more online giving. So there's not as much in the offering plate. You think that might be it?
That's what it is. Yeah, I should have thrown in a debit card or something.
Yeah, there you go.
So, all right, so let's go dive into here. And this is really, this is more towards Sherry's specialty, but what is a permanent fund? So it's something where only the earnings are used and not the principal. And I did put earnings there because it depends on how it's defined. Like the foundation, what we do is we actually look for growth. You could spend the growth of a fund. Some are set up where you can only spend the dividends and the interest of it, but it kind of depends on what it is. But basically, you can't touch that, whatever that principal is, but you can spend above that. It's usually set up by the donor. Of course, the church can help guide them, or somebody can help guide them to set how they set that up. And some examples might be a scholarship fund, an endowment. Those are probably the most common kinds. So, and the so what? So this is what they are, so what? So however you have them invested, you want to maximize earnings. So if you have a permanent fund in a CD, you're not maximizing your earnings, no matter what. I mean, so unless CD rates go back up to 10%, or even 1% would be something, but you want to maximize whatever your earnings are, because that's how that gift was supposed to be made. Is they wanted to maximize earnings. And the next thing you need to do, and this is very important, is document the restrictions. So there's this one quote, and I think it's Harvey McKay, says, pale ink is better than the most retentive memory. It's just really solid, because I was working with the church the other day. A person died, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. I really couldn't tell how long ago it was, but there was an argument on, should this money be only used for missions, or can it be used for other purposes? And our whole thing was, well, what does the documentation say? What did the donor actually write down? And what would you do if you actually couldn't find the documentation, Sherry?
Well, I mean, they can go to the courthouse. They can try to find, if it was, in their will, if it was written in the will. I guess the thing that we like to do is sit down with the donors and help the churches do this as well, and help them identify those pieces. One, to not pigeonhole it, like you were talking about earlier, of having it be so restricted that if we no longer have those programs, that it's not in use. And then two, keep that information on file, so that when you get to the table and people say, and we've heard this, things like this, that might be what the documentation says, but I know what she meant the money to be used for. And this is somebody that's sitting around the table. So the documentation can keep all gifts, and this is a whole nother workshop that we'll have sometime, but gift acceptance policies, so that it stays in the line of the mission of your church. All gifts do.
Because again, this is a permanent fund. This is going to outlive all of us. And for sure, it's going to outlive our memories. I mean, it's amazing. You would think you get, $100,000 gift, you'd always remember what that's for. No, because we'll remember what we want to remember, how we want to remember it is the sad thing. I do the same thing. And actually, one of my favorite committees I work for is the Board of Pensions. And they have all their guidance on the bottom of their report that they see every single quarter because they need that reminder. And because it just is, something comes up and either you're opposed to it or for it and you want to bend the rule. And so you remember the restriction a little differently, but what does the restriction actually say? So.
Jeff, just really quick, I learned that years ago when I was doing some other work for our church. A donor had given some money, and the music program was really important in our church, and he wanted it to go to children's ministry and the music department. And he went as far as putting what percentages, because he knew that people would forget about the children's part because they remembered him as being in the choir. And so your translated memory was even a word, but your memory as it becomes more cloudy. In this case, he was really afraid that the children's ministry wouldn't be receiving those dollars. So we worked on the documentation of that. And that was years ago that I learned how important that was.
That's cool. Yeah, that was one of your first really big jobs of doing that. Okay. Thanks, Kelsey, for popping this up. So we do have another question. Are your permanent funds well documented? So how confident are you in the documentation of yours? Some if you don't have any permanent funds, you don't have a scholarship fund, you don't have an endowment, not applicable. Otherwise, original wording is preserved and we look at it regularly, kind of like my Board of Pensions example is that we look at it, at least once a year or something like that. The original wording, we have it, we just don't look at it, which I'd encourage you to every now and then pop that out because it is helpful to look at that, especially when you're making decisions on these funds. And then not sure we have the original wording and we just rely on memory.
Jeff, it's that fourth one when we hear the "yeah, but" at the table.
Oh,
yeah,
I know.
But
because it's just solves so many arguments if you have that wording. I mean, and again, it's the wording of the donor at the time the gift is given, unless the church and the donor agree to change it, and then it's a mutual change, like let's just say, for example, your person said children's ministry and music ministry. And later on, before this person passed, they decided, well, fine, let's all do 100% to music ministry. If the church agreed to it, then they could change that. And they put that documentation right in the file, right?
Right.
So,
yep.
All right, let's look at the results. A few of them, it's not applicable. We have a few, it's in the minority that actually have it and review it regularly. I'm glad that people have it, that is about half the people have it, which is the majority of the battle. It is getting it in front of people every now and then. And then the last one, a good 1/3 of people, gosh, we don't even know if we have it. And we're just hoping we remember correctly. So that's not totally surprising. So, and it is worth the effort to get that cleared, because when you talk about trying to use money for ministry, understanding those restrictions is a big part of that battle. So then the next one is project funds. And this takes a lot of different forms, but it's money that's raised for a very specific purpose. There's usually an expiration date. So you're gonna finish a project of some kind, whatever that project might look like. Usually it's actually initiated by the leadership of the church. So some examples might be like a capital campaign, a debt retirement, parking lot, a mission trip. It's these things that it's a very clear project. And once it's done, it's done. And so what? First of all, how would you invest it? It depends on when your expiration date is. So if it's a mission trip, yeah, you're not going to invest that. I mean, chances are you're raising it for the spring and you're going to go in the summer, but if it's, let's just say you're raising money for the parking lot and you think you're going to have to replace the parking lot in 10 or so years. well, then you probably do want to put it in something a little bit more like the growth fund or something like that. But then there's some that are in between. We had a church that knew that they were going to build sometime, but they thought 3 to 5 years. So let's go ahead and invest that for a while and get some earnings on it. And then once we get closer and we know that it's going to come, then maybe we should put it more into some place to principal protection is what I called it, which might be CDs, it might be a money market, it might be something else to help preserve it. And again, I think it's super important to document the restrictions. So this is coming up from leadership. And so what do I mean by documenting the restrictions? Well, specifically, what do you do if there's any leftovers? Because that's part of keeping your balance sheet clean. So if you're going to do the parking lot, for example, what happens if you have a little bit of money left over, $1,000 left over? Does it have to stay in there until next time? Or can it go into some other account? What happens if you're raising money for a mission trip? Does it have to stay in there till next mission trip, or can it just go into the general fund? It's nice to try to think through that. I'm going to check our chat real quick. Oh, Sherry, you already got it. You're so good. All right. The next one is the program funds. And so these are tied to a specific ministry or program. And again, they were likely approved by the leadership. Some of them, they've been around for so long, nobody remembers, like your youth fund or your whatever fund. Usually not a large, I see not significant in amount. They're significant, but they're not, it's not like you're going to get $100,000 in your youth fund probably. So your Memorial Fund, Youth Fund, United Methodist Men, United Methodist Women, Christian Ed. Kind of the interesting thing is, and I don't remember if, so kept in checking your savings. It used to be a common practice because people had a tough time keeping their balance sheet together. So you'd have a number of checking accounts. So each one of these used to have sometimes their own checking account. So you'd have a trustees checking account, youth checking account, memorials checking account, UMW checking account, Christian Ed checking account, general fund checking account. I'm probably missing some, but
well, you are, Jeff, because what was the church? One church we worked with had 24. Wasn't it 24?
That's right. And they got it down to
check books.
Did they get it down to 16 or what was the amount? I can't even remember.
It was down under 10 now.
Oh, is it down under 10 now?
I think so.
Yeah, but I mean, it really was one of those things where everything was, and again, if you have a really clean balance sheet, you can track all those different funds right on there, and you can keep it in one. Of course, one of the bonuses is if you do have it in separate, if you have your general fund in a separate checking account, you're never going to spend it. You're never going to go negative there. So, or you shouldn't. You're going to get overdraft. The key thing for these ones is the ministries want to know what their balance. That's the key thing. And what the other key thing is, you need to know who has authority to spend it. And just coming as a church treasurer, I'd have people, especially for like the youth fund or some of these other ones that have a high number of volunteers. People want to spend it, but if you have a youth pastor, I would always want to let them in on it, or whoever is supposed to have the authority. So if it's United Methodist Women or United Methodist Men, maybe it's they have a treasurer that needs to know. So,
Jeff, I think it's really important here too, that people don't spend it if they don't need it, and they spend it on something because they have it in their account. And so they'll purchase something so they can still have that same amount the next year because they want to prove that they need that amount.
yeah.
In good finance and bookkeeping, and really budgeting, it's good to have communication so that they understand that and the people putting it together. But that mentality of use it or lose it is not always healthy for the church, because you'll have an extra something. I can't even think of what it is right now. And which isn't necessary, but those funds might be used in a different way the following year. It just wasn't necessary in this year. So I really try to help people understand the importance of using what they need and helping communicate why they want this budgeted again the following year.
Yeah. The next one is reserves. So this is extra money that you set aside to protect your church, is a lot of ways that I think of it. It's usually to protect your church, either cash flow purposes, or maybe it's almost like insurance to some degree, self-insurance. Normally it's set up by leadership. A good example, you might have a trustees fund that helps for any building maintenance issues that come up. You might have an emergency fund, just in case something crazy happens and giving drops or whatever. So what? I normally think, my own opinion is that this should be invested in a balanced type of fund, because money is going to come in and you want it to grow, and money, hopefully you're not relying on these all the time. I mean, hopefully it's like let's just say, for example, it's your emergency fund. If your church is having an emergency every month, you probably got other issues. If it's your trustees, chances are something major coming up, might be every other year or something like that, but it's not going to be all the time. So it's nice to be able to, I mean, we have one church that they started putting in, I think it was 3% of their offerings into a reserve account to build it up, because they wanted to build it up. And, and then whenever they got a lump sum that they could throw it, they put it in there. And now all of a sudden they feel pretty comfortable, because they made these decisions as a leadership to help protect them, because they don't want their ministry to be put on the back burner as they deal with the eventual replacing of their roof. So I just thought this was a really smart idea to go ahead and pay for it ahead of time, and then they could ask their donors to instead invest in something else more ministry related.
Jeff, I truly believe in that situation too. And that example that you gave is that they've talked about it, these reserve funds, and what these funds are for, and what your 3% is going for. And they keep it in the front of the congregation, rather than having it just going over there and no one discusses it. And so people have been really supportive of that, because they understand what it's for.
Yeah. And one of the things, by the way, that they've done too, is they had to set a target now, that because they never thought they would get enough to actually replace the roof if it came up. So how much is too much? That was a really good question that they asked. Interesting story. I think it was last week, a ministry came to me asking for money, and they had about $100,000 budget, and they wanted $17,000 for their ministry. And I was, I don't know, I'm cheap, so I really wasn't too happy about it. So I started talking to them, and I said, well, what do you have for reserves? And they said, well, we got some stocks, but they're all donor restricted, and we got an endowment. And I said, well, that's fine, and they sent me the restrictions. So that was really cool. Then they're not permanently restricted. They're just restricted on who's able to spend it. But they had, and then I said, well, is there anything else? I mean, do you have any unrestricted reserves? Well, yeah, we kind of do. Turns out the ministry itself has $600,000 in reserves and $100,000 budget. So they had 6 times their operating budget in reserves. And I was like, I'm not giving you any money, by the way. So really, if you want to ask for money from me, you need to figure out what is your target. How much is enough that you need to be able to comfortably weather the storms? Because people didn't give you this money just so you can have a huge safety net. I mean, this is like having a king size bed for a toddler. So that kind of a safety net is what they had. Anyway. And then there's 2 questions to do. Once you set your target, what do you do if it's underfunded? Like that one church we talked about, they were going to put 3% of their offerings into it until they got it up near that target. And what do you do if it's overfunded? That's another good question too, because especially if you haven't invested, sometimes it grows faster than you expect. You get a couple of really good years, and you'll have to make some decisions. So last one is unrestricted funds. So what is it? General fund, operating fund. This is what you're using to pay your regular bills out of. And it includes what you need for cash flow purposes. So one of the decisions too is, if you got a lot in your unrestricted, is there some that needs to be set aside for your reserves if you don't have reserve accounts? So if you have $100,000 in your operating fund, and you only have $100,000 budget, probably you should put some of that aside for your reserves for a rainy day or for the trustees. Because normally you just keep this in checking. And if you, I did this practice back when I was bookkeeper at Bismarck First United Methodist, is I used to put excess into a savings account back when you used to get almost 1% in your savings. I thought I was so smart. Now it doesn't even make a difference really, but I still like the practice, thinking that someday savings, interest rates on savings and money markets will go up again. So anyway, so what we wanted to do is I asked some churches for their balance sheet. And I know that different churches call it different things. So we're going to take a quick poll again to say what your church calls it, because what we really want to know is, what do you call your, whatever it is that has your assets and your debts on it? So your checking account, your investments and that thing. So some call it a balance sheet, some call it a statement of financial position. That's kind of more the nonprofit term. Treasurer's report, especially if you're using like church windows. I've seen that a lot too. Or some people just use Excel and call it the treasurer's report, fund debt balance report, financial statement. Those are the ones that I've seen. And I'm probably missing some, but I should have put an other.
I guess my question would be on this one, Jeff, and we talked about it earlier, is if they're using the balance sheet, is it truly a balance sheet, or is it do they have the restricted funds and the other accounts that sometimes don't always show up on there, or are they using it as an operational expense sheet?
Yeah, because a lot of times what I'll see, here's your beginning balance of your checking, all your income and expenses, and then your ending balance. And then maybe there's the CDs or something on the bottom. And it's just interesting. So
this is good. This is a good response.
Yeah, most of them have it. Yeah, that is good. All right, most people call it a balance sheet, so good. I've been talking about the right language for people. Statement of financial position is the other one that I normally call on. So the first church we're going to look at, normal average attendance of about 50, 40, somewhere around that range. That was pre-COVID. Probably post-COVID, they're probably still about like that. They're kind of a small church. Anyway, this is the bottom of their financial report. So you can kind of see, let me see if I can get my pointer here. I hid some lines here, so that way you can see it, all the income and expenses. But these are their assets. They don't have any debt, but they have a checking account, savings account, memorial savings account balance, and a roof siding. I think this is a CD. But anyway, so what we're going to do is, what does it look like to look at this with fresh eyes? So what does it look like to look at this with fresh eyes? And all of us here are actually looking at it with fresh eyes, unless this happens to be the church is tuning in. This is their balance sheet. Anyway, you're going to ask those questions. And so the first one is, so I would try to categorize it by those different factors. So the project, this is likely a project fund. So how much are we trying to raise? How are we trying to raise it? What do we do if there's any leftovers? That's the type of question I would ask. The next one here is this memorial savings account. So again, this is a program type of one. So again, do they have their own checking account, or is this integrated in there? Or do they know the balance of their account? Who can spend it? Those types of questions. And now they have this savings account. Is this just a reserve account? What is that for? Is this something they're planning on tapping into if they don't raise enough money for the roofing and siding? How is this invested? Is it just getting that whatever it is, 0.1% of savings? How long have they had it? If they've had it for 10 years earning 0.1%, gosh, I mean, I would, maybe it's in CDs too, who knows? But anyway, those are the type of questions I would ask. And again, this is a small church, budget of, I think, around 75,000. So how are you investing that? And then their checking account, that's a lot of money in your checking account too. So is this another reserve too? So I mean, really, if I was looking at this, knowing that they're a small church, they have $210,000, $212,000. How much do I need to be putting aside for that roof? How much should be maybe invested? Those are the type of questions that I'd be thinking of, especially if you're like a number of churches, you're nervous about how you're able to continue. You know, there was a great church that you visited with, one of your first ones, where they looked at you like you were trying to stick them up, you know, and they were really concerned that they were almost that they were their best years were behind them. And they invested with us, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but it completely turned around their whole mindset for ministry when they invested. And they are a small church in a small town, 200 people in the town, no school, yet they've become one of our most generous supporters of conference ministries since then, and other things too. So, and they support a full-time pastor making above minimum comp. So so it just shows you what it did. But before then, they didn't think they could support anything. So all right, so that's a small church's treasurer's report is what they called it. So we got a little. All right, now this is a larger church's, about a medium-sized church. I can't remember, maybe about 200 in attendance. This is QuickBooks, and you can kind of see how they got it set up here. And it's interesting, you know, to have the breakdown and all the different checking accounts. That's how they keep up their balance. And you'll notice one of the things that struck me and Sherry, first of all, when we looked at it, was this number here, that negative general fund balance. And I don't think it's truly negative, because they have like CDs here that are not negative. So, but that to me was interesting to see that. So questions I would
Jeff,
ask.
one of the things with,
Oh,
well, one of the things with this, when if being shared with the finance committee, that would be a red flag right away to see the 30,000 in red in and having an understanding of why that was in the red. So how, you know, how do the other numbers support that, and what can be moved around so that you have money in your general fund?
Because a report can be kind of confusing when I mean, it really can be. When you look at this, are we poor or are we not poor? I mean, do we have enough money? I mean, we got a negative in the general fund, but we got some larger numbers somewhere, other places. And so that's why I like looking at it through, again, fresh eyes. And this is just, again, these are questions. These are not statements, you know. Are these reserves? You know, what are we aiming for our emergency fund? Are we aiming for 1 month of expenses? What are we aiming for? Are we aiming for 6 months? I didn't know about this program ministry fund, what that was for sure. So, I mean, I'm kind of guessing, but, and even that amount in the youth account, I didn't know if that was a reserve, or what it was. But anyway, that was kind of my, again, more of a question than anything else. If these are reserves, is there a way to group them together and maybe invest them? So if they're going to hang out there for the next 3 to 5 years or more. Project funds, you know, the capital improvement fund, is there an upcoming project? You know, what is it? What do we do with the leftover funds? If the leftover funds, do they go in the property maintenance fund afterwards? Same way with the missions and the youth trip. Once they're done, you know, does that go into the youth account reserve, or what happens? Then there's a lot of these program funds. Yeah, and I just highlighted them, and just the idea would be is who has authority to spend them, who has authority to use them. And then we have that unrestricted. And my assumption was, again, that the CDs were unrestricted. So really, I mean, they'd have $55,000 in unrestricted in the general fund if you add those two together. But again, these are just questions, and I would just be wondering, okay, if that's the case, I'd rather have the 55,000 here, and then have maybe the whatever, the program ministry fund invested here, something like that, or the emergency fund invested there, probably both of them. You can probably put 130,000 or whatever more, what is that, 150,000, plug that in over there, and you would still have 150,000 in your checking account. So anyway, but again, those are just the questions I would ask looking at a balance sheet, trying to look with fresh eyes. Now, here's our third church. They are kind of a larger church, 300 to 400 in attendance. Can't remember if this is Church Windows. I think it is Church Windows. And I didn't show all of it. I didn't show Church Windows. They have the whole equity section, which would help explain some of this, because so some of the times, one of the nice things about some church software programs, and specifically Church Windows, is they do manage those equity accounts for you. So anyway, so what is permanent? They do have an endowment, and that is with the foundation. So it's all the way, it's properly documented and cared for. They have some project funds. So they have an account for their trustees and other special projects. Then they also have another account with the foundation for their potential placement of the roof. We've already actually talked about this church to some degree. So because you can see also they have another one for their reserve account, and that's where they're putting in 3% for their reserve account. Again, they're investing both for the roof fund as well as the reserve account, as well as they have extra money that they've decided to invest too for the program ministries. Normally, you don't see people investing their program ministries, but they did. This church decided to do that because they were in a healthy cash position. So, and lastly, there is this unrestricted, which includes your accounts payable minus your payroll taxes. And this actually, their checking account is a mix of program funds and unrestricted. But anyway, so again, when you're looking at it, it's nice to try to classify them. So then you get to know what, so if I would have a permanent fund on there, I'd ask, okay, where's the original documentation? How can we spend it? How is it to be used? If it's a project fund, okay, what's the deadline in this project? How much do we need to raise? What do we do with the leftovers? Reserve fund, is it invested? Especially if you're not, if it's a significant balance and you normally are trying to use it as a emergency fund, so only using it for emergencies. How is it invested? Program funds, who has authority to spend it? Unrestricted, is it positive? Is it so much that we should put some more into reserves? So those are the kind of questions you would ask. All right. So I'm just going to quickly just do a quick review. So when you're taking a fresh look, and again, the audit is a perfect time, or that very first time of the year is probably the best time to just take an extra close look at it. Ask those questions, that we just went through. Document the answers actually is a huge one. So no matter what it is, document it just for your own knowledge. So who has spending authority? That might go into your policies. What are the donor restrictions? That goes into some other kind of permanent file. You might have to make some decisions. So if you got some old stuff out there that you need to let go, finance committee, make a recommendation to the board and have them make a decision on that. So using the best of your knowledge, if you have some old accounts out there that maybe are permanently restricted, but you don't have the original documentation, you've had no success finding it, make a decision on, let's set the restriction now as best as we know it. So because you do want to always honor the donor and honor the work that your church has been given.
Yeah, Jeff, staying in line with the vision of the church as you're doing that, so that a fund or a group of individuals with that fund don't derail and really hijack the vision and the mission of the church.
All right, that's all we have. We kind of went a little late, kind of normal. So
this is our new norm. We're no longer 7:40, we're 7:50.
Yeah. So we always try to aim for kind of be done by 7:45 at the latest. So we're 7:50 almost right now. We thank you, by the way, for your, if you have any questions, by the way, feel free, if you haven't popped them on the chat, you can always email us or message us or whatever. And check out our website. That's the brand new logo for the Dakotas, Minnesota Methodist Foundations, by the way. Looks very sharp. And yeah.
The other thing is that our next one will be in May. And of course, I don't have that exact date in front of me, but we will be talking about turning money into ministry. So some of these pieces that we have hinted on tonight, we're going to go into a little bit more detail and talk about the practices in your church. Are they transactional, or what's your decisions being made? Are they transformational? And so we will talk about that in May.
Yeah.
So we thank everybody. Thanks for spending your 7 o'clock with us tonight, and we will hopefully see you in May. Have a good evening, y'all.